Life and faith, the two are intimately connected. For more than 2 decades, Life and Faith Television has painted pictures and told stories of faith journeys here in southwestern Ontario. Join us now as we continue the tradition. We explore the diversity in our lives of faith and the faith of our lives.
Good morning and welcome to Life and Faith. On today's show, our faith journeys take us to a discussion with Archdeacon Paul Feheley, the speaker at the Bishops' Conference on Prayer. Then to the stories of Deb Elliott and Don Gibson, who have been working as a pastoral team in Latin America. And finally, we're honored to bring you part 2 of our discussion with Order of Canada recipient Hanny Hassan. Recently, the Bishops' Conference on Prayer was hosted again in the Diocese of Huron, and Reverend Keith Nethery met with the speaker, the Venerable Paul Feheley, to discuss his work as Principal Secretary to the Primate of Canada, the Most Reverend Fred Hiltz, and he tells us how this all ties in with his own prayer life.
Paul, we'll get to the national church. There's lots of exciting and interesting things going on there, but first let's talk a little bit about the conference and the themes that you'll be addressing this weekend.
Keith, thanks so much, and it's a great privilege to be here and to have an opportunity to speak on your show. There's actually 2 parts to the conference. On the first evening, I've designed a liturgy that is a little different than the normal prayer service. And what I'm hoping to achieve is to illustrate a way that a service can take place, which is ecumenical, fairly short, and can touch and speak to people's heart. A lot of the problem we have with services of prayer is that they're too text-orientated and don't speak to the heart. So the Friday night program is really centered on that. I'm using the story from John's Gospel of the washing of the feet and use a piece of art that I found, which is a magnificent picture of Christ washing Peter's feet. And as you'll recall in that story, there's some resistance from Peter, and that's part of the evening presentation. So that'll be the Friday night one. On the Saturday, which is a more broadly based group of people, I've decided also to use a piece of art, Rembrandt's painting of the prodigal son. And I'm going to speak in 3 different parts about the younger son, the older son, and then the father. The overall title for the program is The Many Faces of Prayer. And what I'm hoping is that through seeing the story, sort of looking at each person themselves in a mirror and seeing how the younger son, the elder son, and then the father react and act in the story, that they might see themselves, their own face in prayer, and sort of grow from there. So that's what our plan for the conference.
Should be interesting. Certainly prayer is a central focus to the Christian faith. Talk a little bit about the place of prayer and the place of the Anglican Fellowship of Prayer.
I'm a huge fan of the Fellowship of Prayer, and the difficulty for a lot of us is that we get stumbling because we know a number of prayers by rote, the Lord's Prayer, for example, and we can rhyme it off and chime it off without even thinking about it. And that's the danger of prayer. The other is that we get too sophisticated. We think, well, I can't talk to God because the language isn't right, or God won't like this, or that sort of thing. And of course, to my mind, that's nonsense. What God wants is for us to speak in our own language, in our own way, and have that kind of conversation in terms of prayer. I think it was Fulton Sheen who once said the problem with most prayer is that we do all the talking and not enough listening. And I think the Fellowship of Prayer, with its organization across the country and diocesan reps and parish reps, is really trying to encourage people to open up, to think in a new way about prayer so that they can truly speak to God and more especially hear from God.
Moving on to the national church, 4 years ago in Winnipeg, the Bishop of Nova Scotia and PEI, Fred Hiltz, was elected as the primate of the Anglican Church and of Canada, and you have been by his side as the principal secretary throughout his term of office as it continues. Tell us a little bit about what that journey has been like over the last 4 years.
Well, Keith, it's been a wonderful journey. Archbishop Fred is a really unique kind of individual. He cares deeply for the people of the church. And in that caring, he takes great time to prepare things. A lot of times people who are executives, who are at the top of the food chain, as it were, will have people like me, for example, write and do all sorts of research. That's not what Fred does. Every letter, every sermon you get from Fred is his own hand, in his own hand writing it, in terms of developing it and that sort of thing. So he's a very humble man, a very gracious man. He always has time for people. It's almost a fault in a way, because I'm trying to manage the calendar and pulling my hair out and saying, well, you said you'd do this, you said you'd do this. Oh yeah, well, we'll figure it out, and that sort of thing. So there's a graciousness, there's a humbleness. He coined a phrase at the very beginning of his primacy about our beloved church. And that phrase has really kind of dictated how his ministry's developed.
It certainly is a time of change in the church. What's ahead for the Anglican Church of Canada? What are some of the things that you see kind of bubbling around the edge, and Vision 219 and things like that come to mind? What are we looking at as you continue to journey with the primate through the next few years?
I think there's a couple of things that are on the horizon. Our General Synod in 2013 is actually going to be a joint one with the Lutherans, and so that's another way of celebrating that. And that'll be another step forward in our working relationship. But I think the other thing that's on the horizon, I think there are some wonderful challenges before us. It's a bit of a cliche now, but we're out of a certain style of being church, the old, if you build it, they will come. And we're into some real challenges around mission. And I think this is where the next sort of exciting phase for the church will be. Hearing the Word of God, taking it out into the world. We can't afford as a church any longer to simply say, well, we're an Anglican church and we can just build them and expect people to come. Generally, people don't listen to denominations. What they're looking for is a place where it speaks to my heart, where my children are cared for, where there's a sermon that, Monday around the water cooler, I can remember it and I can talk about it. And so there's advances and changes in liturgy. I think clergy training is going to some new levels and that sort of thing. And I think we're moving away from kind of the molds that we had into some new ways of being church.
Let's tie the whole thing together. We started on the conference on prayer. My guess is that you are privileged to see prayer in a lot of different ways and a lot of different experiences. How does prayer undergird the whole ministry that you do, that our primate Fred Hiltz does, and that you see as you travel across Canada and in fact around the world?
Boy, that could be a whole show in itself, couldn't it? For me, I'm going to talk personally, if I might, for a moment. I tend to try to use two styles of prayer that are important for me. The first is a morning prayer and an evening prayer, which is pretty standard text stuff from books and that sort of thing. But I find having that daily pattern an important element for me. It's one of the very first things I do when I wake up. I in fact use a website prayer service that has it all laid out. But I find that discipline for me is a really helpful thing. The other side of that is more of the Celtic tradition of everything I do is sort of centered and surrounded in prayer. And so I'll find myself during the course of the day kind of pausing, even if it's briefly, to kind of reflect and think, God, you were with me in that, or God, help me with this, because this email that I'm about to type is a difficult one, or this phone call coming and I recognize who it's from and there's a big issue and that sort of thing. So there's a sense of undergirding each thing I do, both with the formal stuff and then, as I say, that kind of Celtic notion of everything in prayer. I think that Fred would want to say something of the same answer in terms of he's very much a man of prayer, and you'll find that he finds the quietness is one of his ways. Around the world, I can think one of the most special moments that I've ever had in my life was having a morning prayer service, about 4 or 5 of us in the chapel in the basement of Lambeth Palace. And the Archbishop of Canterbury was there as part of it. He wasn't leading the prayer, but he was part of it. And it was in the quietness of that, when we got there, which was about 10 or 15 minutes early, the Archbishop was already there in his quietness. And you saw that, at least I saw that, as a wonderful example of, here's a man who has all of the cares of the world, but where does he start his day? In the quietness of the crypt of Lambeth Palace in prayer. That's the example that stays with me constantly as I move forward in my own life.
Our thanks to Archdeacon Paul Feheley, the Principal Secretary to the Primate of the Anglican Church of Canada, for guesting with us today on Life and Faith. This is Reverend Keith Nethery.